I don't want to steal our next speaker's thunder, but I do want to take 30 seconds to say that the next person who's going to be honored here, I owe him a debt, as does my son. He was the one that led me from my journalistic stance as a reporter to become an advocate. It's all your fault. You're the one that introduced George and me to Darfur, and we are infinitely grateful for that. Thank you. So, now, as I said, I wouldn't steal our next speaker's thunder, but I just did a little. Because we are so pleased to welcome back to Dayton Mr. Taylor Branch, 2008 Dayton Literary Peace Prize Lifetime Achievement recipient, honored for the quarter of a century spent meticulously researching and documenting 14 critical years in American history. What a year it was last year, just like this. What a great place to be tonight. Taylor Branch is widely regarded as the authoritative literary voice of the civil rights movement in America. I don't think that's an exaggeration. I really don't. Mr. Branch has won nearly every major American literary award for his acclaimed trilogy, America in the King Years, an epic history of the entire civil rights era. Its most important leader, Martin Luther King Jr. The trilogy includes, of course, the Pulitzer Prize-winning Parting the Waters, which also won the National Book Critics Award. The Pillar of Fire, that's 1998, and At Canaan's Edge, that was 2006. Remarkable body of work. Remarkable fellow. Mr. Taylor Branch, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you very much. It's nice to be back here, a thrill really, to be back here in this beautiful space with you for this wonderful award. I want to tell Nick and Nina that in case they ever doubt their son's influence in the world, they can cite to him at least one bald American who pursued Dapper Dan's hair pomade under the influence of "Oh Brother, Where Art Thou?" Didn't make a lot of sense, but that's the craziness of film. I missed being here with my mom. She was here last year. She had a great time. She made an indelible impression on some of you, given some of the comments I've had, and I know you made an indelible impression on her. She misses you all. She's due for a knee replacement, so she couldn't come. I do want to beg your indulgence just for a couple of comments. I have a book out now about keeping a secret diary with President Clinton, and the only reason I mention it is because we were sitting up late at night secretly recording conversations about the Dayton peace process. I was there with him the night before the peace process was finally ratified and heard him say to Secretary Christopher, "Chris, shut it down if you have to. You can't make peace, you can't impose peace on people. You've just got to give them a chance." And he thought that it was not going to occur. And it finally did, and he went through a lot of ordeal over that. A couple of years earlier in our very first session, he told me, he said, "I want the future to know that the reason Dayton has been hard, that the Bosnia, but long before Dayton was heard of, that Bosnian peace and to stop this genocide has been so difficult, among other reasons, is that there are powers on this earth who say in public that this is a terrible genocide, but who say in private that no Muslim nation belongs in Europe, and that this will pass away under the scourge of time." He said, "We're not that far from the kind of diplomacy that we had in World War II when the nations of the Western world turned a blind eye to Jews fleeing Hitler's Germany." And it hasn't been that long in human progress either. A few years later, One thing also comes to mind in connection with tonight's honorees. He said late one night that he had just returned from his fourth conversation with Pope John Paul II, in which John Paul said that he believed that the solution to the world's birth problem was the education of poor women in countries around the world, that they would find a way to limit their families if they knew how to read and write, that millions, hundreds of millions of illiterate women would be able to do it. And the president said, "Your Holiness, won't you say that out loud?" And the Pope said he wished he could say it out loud. He believed it and he was working on it, but there were too many problems with patriarchy in the Catholic Church that he couldn't quite say it. But I thought of that in thinking of our honoree tonight, about the poor women around the world. That we have an honor tonight for Sheryl and for Nicholas Kristof, who are drawing our attention to the issue of women who hold up half the sky, to the plight of women around the world who, if were educated and if in possession of their rights, and if in possession even of their bodies, would make this a better world, by far. 20 years ago, Nick and Sheryl earned awards with vivid accounts of the atrocities at Tiananmen Square. Not just the atrocities, but the courage of the people who are not forgotten. And don't forget that they're not forgotten, because that's what eventually will be the seeds and the yeast that will change China and the world. Now, they deserved their honors then, writing in the New York Times. What a wonderful platform. Most people who earn awards like that in a far-off place, by now, 20 years later, would be a bureau chief or someplace very comfortable on Johnny Apple's luncheon budget. Instead, Nick and Sheryl went to the far corners of the earth and places a lot less comfortable and a lot more scary, even than Tiananmen Square, writing about slavery and trafficking, genocide, all around the world. Their work has unique aspects to it, beyond the fact that they have the trumpet of the New York Times and are single-handedly, in my view, a link to the great tradition of the New York Times reporters of the civil rights era who risked their lives to bring us the stories of the sit-ins and the freedom rides, and of Selma, of John Herbers and Claude Sitton. That's the work that they've done. They've traveled. What's unique about their work is their perspective, that they bring us the perspective of people whose voices would never otherwise be heard in the remotest corners and the most God-forsaken places on earth. And they bring us this perspective in a technique that is rare and unique to them, which is that they tell personal stories of people that we care about in ways that raise up to the great global challenges of our era. This is a gift, this is a calling, it's a great talent that they do so. Now, the thrust of these stories that's been in the New York Times, and that we've all seen it, is such that we tend to think it's a lost cause with a good heart. That it's humanitarian. But it's much, much more than that. Because they wrestle with some of the most difficult ideas coming out of the most intractable problems on earth. Nick and Sheryl raised the question, don't be so facile, Americans, to say shut down all of the sweatshops in the world, because those same sweatshops are the escape routes for millions of young women who escape villages where they are oppressed. It is a step up. Think before you condemn too quickly. They also warn us not to be too facile in condemning even something like Rwanda, which is a genocide, but don't lose sight of the fact that 15 years later, Rwanda is a country that has the most female legislators on earth. How are those two things related? How should we think about them? These are really difficult issues, and I think that above everything else that their work lays before us, Nick and Sheryl confront us with the fact that the humanitarian issues of poverty, of fistulas for women, of genital mutilation, are one and the same with the issues of justice, subjugation, and survival in a shrinking world that will touch us all. So we can't separate ourselves from these issues. And for that reason, their journalistic crusade is a lesson and an inspiration for us all. I am immensely proud to associate myself with their work. To have won the same prize is a humbling experience for me. It is an honor for you to have them here, an honor for me to bestow the Lifetime Achievement Award for the Dayton Literary Peace Prize to Sheryl WuDunn and her lifetime partner, who is here among us. Their work is an inspiration and a challenge, but for one moment, let us make it also a pleasure to have Nick here among us to receive this award.
Well, thank you very much. I should say, first of all, that Sheryl sends her regrets that she's not here. We have 3 kids, 2 teenagers, and a 12-year-old who's an aspiring teenager. And if she were to come as well, we're not quite sure how many kids we would return to. It seems safer to have her stay behind, but she does send her regrets. We did wonder a little bit about the idea of achieving a Lifetime Achievement Award. It made us feel a little bit dated. We kind of wondered if, if there was something happening pretty soon that we didn't know about. But we're, in fact, only 83 years old each, and that was a joke. Sheryl would make sure that you know that was a joke. I wanted to start by telling you about something that Sheryl and I encountered when we first moved to China. It was shortly before Tiananmen, and it was one of the episodes that has kept in the back of our minds is one of the things one needs to do to approach these kinds of issues that involve conflict, peace, difficult moral issues. And I want to ask you how you would have handled the same situation. We had to live in the particular New York Times apartment. We were obliged by the Chinese government to live there, and we knew, in fact, that it was bugged, not least because the buggers all worked on the top floor, and they changed shifts, so you could see them coming out and going in. And in fact, one of our Chinese friends, worked as a part-time translator to produce these transcripts of our conversations. But we didn't know exactly where the bugs were, and then somebody pointed out to us where he said that they were. It was a grill in our apartment, high up on the wall, and it was covered with this wire mesh, and he said, that's where one of the bugs is. So I took a ladder, climbed up there, pried off the grill, and behind it was a little cubby hole. And I was so proud of my newfound Chinese, I recognized that the characters on all this electronic gadgetry in there, the characters read the equivalent of electronic sound carrying device. So we'd found the bug. So Sheryl and I, through our mastery of works of literature such as Robert Ludlum, we knew how to handle this. we went to the bathroom and turned on the shower and the faucets and whispered into each other's ears. And we discussed how to deal with the bugs. And one option was to destroy them. Another option was to leave them in place. The third option would be to leave them in place, but use them as our secret disinformation channel to the Chinese government. Well, we were debating this. We quickly came to a conclusion how we would handle it. I want to ask what you would have done. Those are your options. You can leave them in place. You can smash them, or maybe the other way around. You can smash them, leave them in place, or leave them in place and use them for disinformation. So how many of you would have smashed them? Okay. How many of you would have left them in place? You don't seem a hugely well-behaved crowd. I may pass on your names to the Chinese government, see if you ever get a visa again. And how many of you would have left them in place and used them for a disinformation channel? Great minds think alike. I mean, Sheryl and I had just decided on that strategy when a friend arrived at the front door and we found out what an electronic sound carrying device is in Chinese. It's a doorbell buzzer. Well, we felt pretty deflated, frankly. And it was a useful introduction, though, in living abroad and reporting abroad, in trying to report on these issues. And the basic lesson that we absorbed was that everything is always a lot more complicated than you think it is, and that it's really necessary to approach all these issues with a lot of humility. In fact, I think if we'd approached Iraq with a little more sense of complexity and humility, we could have indeed avoided a lot of problems there. But there's also a danger, a contrary danger, of being paralyzed by complexity, being paralyzed by nuance. And William Butler Yeats, as I'm sure many of you know, talked of how the best lack all conviction, the worst are full of passionate intensity. And I'm sure that sentiment kind of rings a bell with some of us. The challenge, I think, for all of you are the best, is to carry that same kind of passion while acknowledging that our views carry with them maybe a certain cultural burden, that we may well be wrong, that our views are tentative, and yet still not be afraid to make moral judgments while acknowledging that perhaps they're wrong and to act upon them. It's a difficult terrain to maneuver. It's a complicated one. It can contain inconsistencies, but I think it also reflects the very complicated world out there. Let me tell you how I became engaged in some of these issues, because it's not intuitive that a New York Times reporter would be running around places like Darfur, Congo, red light districts in Cambodia, wherever it may be. And in fact, it's all been about the sights that I've seen and the people that I've encountered. And one thing we've learned from recent work in social psychology is that that's how it always works. It's not a rational process, it's an emotional process of building these connections. And in the case of Darfur, the issue that Nick has done great work on, it was from an original trip back at the beginning of 2004, and I went into Darfur not really knowing what to expect. And I stayed for a little while with a Darfuri family that was in hiding in the desert there. They'd been driven out of their home, and there isn't much water there. So the only place to get water was in wells that were scattered fairly far apart. And there were Janjaweed, the Sudanese militia, they were Janjaweed by the wells. If a man went to the well, a Darfuri man went to the well, he'd be shot. If a woman went, she'd be raped. This family didn't know quite what to do, but its only solution was to send their small children with donkeys. These were 10-year-old kids across the desert for miles with a donkey to go to the well to fill up these huge jugs of water to bring them back, because the Janjaweed, usually, for the most part, if they were lucky, would not bother the small kids. And I watched these families send their little kids, and it broke my heart. And I thought about what I would do with my kids. And I returned originally thinking, oh, I'm never going to go back. But I kept thinking about that family, about all those other families out in the desert having to make those same kinds of decisions. I couldn't leave that behind. And that's what led me to go back again and again and again. Likewise, on the issue of trafficking that Ben has done such extraordinary work on. The original motivation wasn't the work that I had encountered intellectually. It was a reporting trip that I made back in 1996 about child prostitution to Asia, child prostitution in Asia, and I was just blown away by what I found. I saw 12, 13-year-old girls who were locked up pending the sale of their virginity. I came across two girls who had, while walking to school, had come across a woman who'd been feeling faint and sick and had helped her, taken her to shade, and then she felt better, that woman felt better, and thanked those two girls by giving them a drink. Next thing that happened was the two girls collapsed unconscious, and the woman put them on the back of a rickshaw and drove them to a brothel to sell them there. And maybe above all, I spent an afternoon in a brothel in Phnom Penh interviewing a 14-year-old who'd been sold by her stepfather and a 15-year-old who'd been kidnapped by a neighbor and sold to that brothel. They were slaves in every sense. The main difference from 19th century slavery was these girls were going to be dead of AIDS by the early 20s. And they told me in particular how after the 15-year-old had disappeared after she'd been kidnapped, her mother had searched all over Cambodia to try to find her. And in Cambodia, if your teenage daughter goes missing, the place you look is the red light districts. So just a week before I got there, that mother had gone to that red light district and into that brothel, and it had this joyous reunion with her daughter. In my naivete, I asked, why didn't your mother take you out, take you away? And the girl said, the brothel owner said that she'd paid good money for me. My mother would have to buy me back. She didn't have the money. I walked out of that brothel knowing that I had a great front page story and that these two girls who were the focus of it were going to die of AIDS. It seemed unfair, and it seemed, frankly, exploitative of them. I was one more man walking in and getting what I needed and walking out and leaving them to die. So when I returned as a columnist, I didn't want the same thing to happen. And some of you may know what happened next. I wrote about it at the time, wrote about it again in Half the Sky. I chose two girls who were going to be the new focus of my columns as a way to tell this story. I didn't want to just leave them behind to die. I didn't know quite what to do. I called up the New York Times lawyer to discuss how to handle this, and I said, David, do we have a policy on buying human beings? Turns out we didn't. And I ended up buying one for $150 and the other for just over $200. And I got receipts from the brothels. When you get a receipt from brothels for buying two teenage girls, when you gain legal title to two kids, that should be a blot on the conscience of the 21st century. There are a couple of questions that people often ask me about this kind of work. One is, isn't it incredibly depressing? And I think that one reason why people sometimes steer clear of human rights work is this perception that it's just so depressing to get involved in. I'm always struck that when I interview humanitarians, they always tell me how everything is always going wrong and so difficult. And when I interview corporate CEOs, they always tell me how everything is going great, even if their company is going down the toilet. And I think there's actually maybe a use, there's something there that we can learn from. Because in fact, my experience has been that this is an area that is ultimately not depressing, but truly inspiring, and that we shouldn't guilt trip people into getting involved, but should make it clear that this is an incredible opportunity that we benefit as well. You know, on my last trip to Eastern Congo, I was outraged by the warlords, the mass rape, and all that. But the thing that struck me most, my most enduring memory of my last trip to Eastern Congo, was of this incredible Polish nun in the town of Rutsuru. There, keeping these orphans alive, feeding these children, keeping the warlords at bay. And I just came back and I wanted to grow up and be a Polish nun. And likewise, in the Cambodian brothels, my last trip, I saw a girl who'd been kidnapped at 13. And because the brothel owner found her uncooperative, she gouged out the girl's eye. I came back and, you know, if I had found that brothel owner, I would have torn her head off. Although that might have undermined my humanitarian image, I guess. But ultimately, what I think most about that trip isn't anger at that, but rather it's the inspiring story of those who were helping that girl. And above all, there was a woman named Somali Mam, who I think was actually nominated for this award as well, who had herself been trafficked and had escaped, and has devoted her life since then to helping others escape, to looking after them, to risking her life, using her savings to help others. And that kind of expression of humanity to help other people is something that you always see in the most stressed parts of the globe. And in contrast, what I really do find depressing sometimes is to come back here and see people for whom there's no greater expression of humanity than to have the newest car, the latest cell phone. That is what is truly depressing. Another question that I think that people often ask is, does it really make a difference? These issues are so huge: trafficking, maternal mortality, genocide. You know, what can anybody actually do? I think there are a lot of people who would like to help, both because it's the right thing to do and because maybe they want to set an example of empathy or compassion for their children. But they're worried about corruption, about big aid organizations, about whether things really make a difference at the grassroots level. All those are legitimate questions. There is a lot of corruption. There are a lot of aid projects that just don't work. Anybody who's traveled in the developing world has seen wells that have been built, and then a few months later the pump breaks and it can't be repaired, and it's just a monument to one more failed project. These are legitimate concerns. But anybody who has also traveled has seen extraordinary examples of change and of investing in people that have made an incredible difference. And I think we're getting much better at figuring out how we can make a difference, what works, what doesn't work. And so I do indeed hope that you will get engaged in some of these issues, some of these causes. Certainly needs you. And you're not going to solve the overall issue of trafficking. You're not going to solve the overall issue of fistulas or genocide, whatever it may be. But you can make a difference in real people's lives. I often traveled with a Hawaiian cameraman together in some of these places. And he used to tell me a Hawaiian story that is really hokey. I'm sure some of you have heard it, but it always resonates in my mind. It's about a boy walking along the shore, and all the starfish have washed up. Do you know this story? All the starfish have washed up on the shore, and the boy is throwing them back into the sea. And a man comes up and says, "What are you doing? There are thousands of starfish that are washed up. You can't make a difference." And the boy keeps on throwing them back and says, "Well, sure made a difference to that one." And that's exactly what I see. The final question is the why should I care question. And one answer is that if you've seen a 13-year-old girl who's had her eye gouged out, you don't ask that question. And if you think about the amounts that we spend on coffee each day and how that can transform somebody's life by paying their school fee so they can stay in school, for example. Again, you don't ask that question. But there's also a more personal answer, and so often in writing our most recent book, we came across people in America who started off getting engaged thinking, I'm so busy, this is going to be a sacrifice, I've got so much to do, but I really should do it, and they approach it as a burden, and then gradually they discover it's incredibly enriching and fulfilling. It's the best thing they've done. It's a huge source of meaning in their life. And I think especially after a time of economic difficulty here, where material roads no longer seem so great a source of satisfaction in one's life, perhaps, that engaging in these other areas, I think, does feel more fulfilling. And there's been, again, some great work in social psychology over the last 15 years. It looks at what makes us happy. And I mean, one answer is brain chemicals, but the result of those brain chemicals is that some people tend to have a base level that makes them quite happy, others middling level, others not so happy, other kind of the Eeyore people. And all the things that we think are going to make us happier or less happy tend not to. Winning the lottery, being in a terrible car accident, being crippled. Those don't tend to change our long-term happiness level. But one thing does, and you know what that is? It's getting engaged in a cause larger than ourselves. That really moves your base level, whether you start out high up, middling, or lower. And I think it also gives you a new perspective. Let me leave you with a story of a friend of mine, a young American woman who was an aid worker in Darfur. I met her there. She was incredibly tough. She saw things nobody should ever have to see and never broke down, never flinched. She came back here over Christmas vacation. She's in her grandmother's backyard in the US. She totally breaks down. She loses it. She's weeping. You know what it was? She saw a bird feeder that her grandmother had put out. And my friend thought about how she'd just come from a place where people were throwing babies into bonfires because of the color of their skin and the tribe they belonged to. She thought how she'd had the incredible good fortune to come from a country where we take security for granted, where we have such wealth that we not only look after our own material needs, but we have a little extra to help make sure that wild birds don't go hungry in the winter. My friend just saw her life in a new perspective, and with it, a sense of obligation. That's us. The fact that we are here in this room is a reflection of the fact that we have all won the lottery of life, if you will. And because we have won that lottery of life, the next question is indeed precisely how we go about discharging that responsibility. Thank you so much for this award on behalf of myself and Sheryl. We're delighted to be here. Thank you very much.